Welcome to Dark Sorcery. I'm Alfredo Martinez, and I have with me Gazelam Ali. Good to have you back on, Gazelam.
Hey, good to see you, Alfredo. Dark Sorcery.
Dark Sorcery. And today we're going to be talking about, we're actually doing a Mesoamerican Spirituality Part 3. So we're going to be discussing four different Aztec gods and the feasts and sacrificial rites, associated with them. So we're going to be talking about Huitzilopochtli, which is the god of warfare and the sun, Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, sorcery, and destiny, and then also Zutekutli, the god of fire, and then Tlaloc, the god of rain, water, and earthly fertility.
Nice.
Now, is there anything that stood out when you were researching about these four gods?
Well, I hate to get all zeitgeisty, and I don't mean like a worldview. I mean like the movie zeitgeist, where
Yeah.
they make up these kind of crazy connections with how Dionysus is, Jesus Christ, and Ishtar is Easter and all that, because most of that stuff is just bullshit. But it does seem really interesting how there are these weird comparable type of things where you have Shutley who is the heart is sacred to him, and he's the one that brought fire to humanity, and the commonality with Prometheus, how his heart is pecked out by an eagle, and he's the one that brought fire to humanity, and Lucifer is also attributed to Prometheus a lot, and it's funny because I come from kind of a theosophical background, um, in my 20s, studying stuff like The Power of Myth by Joseph Campbell and stuff, where he makes all these connections and things. But in a way, it does seem to hold true, in the sense that the reason that the Mexica people and people from Mesoamerica did and end up embracing eventually Christianity was because they found certain commonalities in Christianity that they could attribute to their own gods, as you see in like Santeria and um, different type of religions like that. And so it it is weird how there's kind of this mythos. I guess it's just human nature to kind of come up with these stories, even though I I just don't like to take the colonizers and end up putting everything on that. But it is kind of curious, and that's one thing that stood out to me anyway.
Yeah, you will see some kind of crossover as far as stories and lore and mythology, especially if the cultures are neighboring cultures. You'll find some similarities there. But yeah, let's go ahead and start by talking about Huitzilopochtli, the god of warfare and the sun. Now, the Aztecs believed that he fed on human blood and hearts, so of course they sacrificed people in his honor. But they believed that warriors who died in battle became hummingbirds. I guess the hummingbird was associated with him, and also the color blue. I mean, let me ask you this: what would you say is the significance of the strong color blue? Because the sacrificial people who were being sacrificed would be covered in blue, heart taken out, and then they would be pushed down the steps, cut in body parts, and eaten by other people.
Yeah, I think the thing that's interesting about Huitzilopochtli is that in Aztec and Mexica religion, there were four Quetzalcoatls, and those four Quetzalcoatls were had the different four corners of the earth, or the four dispensations attributed to them, and each one was assigned a color. And so
Right.
you have the blue Quetzalcoatl was Huitzilopochtli, where you have like the yellow or red, that's Zepetotec, the white Quetzalcoatl, and then of course who we'll be talking today about, Tezcatlipoca, is the black Quetzalcoatl, and so they're
Right.
kind of attributes. And so I think that, you know, the color we're associated with that. I don't know why they. I mean, it's a strong image,
Blue
painting
was,
somebody blue like that.
it's it's to me it kind of symbolizes blue being peaceful and calming things down, maybe in preparation for something in the afterlife, or something to do with the spirit realm. Now, I'm assuming this rite that we're talking about, where you cover the person in blue, take their heart out, push them down the steps, that's the same rite that we see in the movie Apocalypto. Do you remember that scene?
Oh yeah,
I'm assuming it's the same thing that we're talking about that they presented in the movie.
yeah. They say that a lot of Apocalypto was
But
kind
that
of
was the
made up
Mayans
and
though in
things,
that movie,
but
right?
yeah, and so that's where I think what happened is that they ended up kind of merging a lot of Azteca stuff and putting that on top of the Mayan thing. So it is actually incorrect, but um, he should have probably. Yeah, I don't know why he made it the Mayans when it should have been the Mexicas.
Unless the the Mayan people had a god that was very similar, and uh, a rite that was maybe something that was borrowed from cultures. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just Mel Gibson. He has alternative motives when he does stuff like that, especially with Apocalypto. I mean, he's a big Christian and into the whole apocalypse thing and stuff. And so, I
Yeah,
think he was trying to show how those days are like how these days are going to be in our current time and things. And so
right.
it makes for an awesome movie. I really like that film, but
It's a good
some of
movie,
it's pretty.
but one thing you have to consider is that it's made by a strong Christian guy who's trying to present this information. So
Yeah, and it's someone who's, an admitted anti-Semite and things. That guy's kind of a joke.
yeah, he's definitely different. But
In fact, what was his Jesus movie that he did? Was
the passion of the
the
Christ.
Passion of Christ. My friend always would call it the Passion of beating the shit out of Christ.
That's basically what it is. The whole movie.
No,
It's a
right?
big gore fest.
But he has some albino guy that's playing Lucifer and stuff. It's it's funny.
Yeah, it was presented in a unique way. But yeah, when the body would go to the bottom of the steps, be pushed down, and then they would cut it up and then serve it to people, and people would eat the different body parts.
Yeah,
But
what's interesting about that is his mother has a skirt made out of serpents and things, and this is another kind of connection with the whole Christian thing, is that she was impregnated by a ball of feathers, and then when he was born, both him and his sister, Koyolshuki, she also were trying to murder him before he was born, and so that ritual of being pushed down the stairs, and then they would land on this giant stone altar piece that had her image of it, where she was headless and her arms were cut off, and so that whole thing was a reenactment of the myth that was in their stories, and so
mm,
that's what's happening with that. Pretty
it's
crazy.
interesting. I think it's easy to overlook the strong symbolism in some of these rites, especially since no one around today was alive then to understand the context or the mentality of them approaching this.
Yeah, and there's a big debate on how much it was exaggerated by the conquest and things like that, because most of the codices that survived were written after the conquest, and also they were they were so appalled by what they saw because they misunderstood it so much that they would kind of exaggerate stories, like the numbers just don't count. Don't.
Well, I imagine that coming from a missionary perspective of them being from the Christian church coming over, maybe they wanted to exaggerate it to make it seem harsher than it really is, so that they can, I don't know, have more missionaries or get more funding to come over there and raid more, or for whatever reason they were trying to convince somebody to make it look worse than it really was. But then again, we can only guess at that.
Yeah, but I think, it would be a big propaganda piece to end up exaggerating that, just because it was looked at as being a form of Satan worship and things, to them, which is
Right.
ridiculous because they're worshiping a corpse on a cross,
Yeah.
So
It's, I mean, to someone who comes from a different timeline or a different culture, to just see something like that, a man hung on a cross that's being tortured to death, but they worship that symbol. I mean, that would seem sadistic to somebody who came into Western civilization, had no idea about that. And I mean, death is just as much a part of reality as life is. Nature can be, beautiful and blessing, but nature can be cruel as well.
well, and I love how Huitzilopochtli is attributed to the hummingbird. We have a lot of hummingbirds down here in Arizona, and they're so cool, and they're really badass. They can be really mean when the males start fighting each other and stuff. And you have these little teeny birds that they have so much energy that they have to constantly be drinking sugar in order to even stay alive because their wings bat so fast.
Well,
But they'll
yeah,
come right
it's
up to
crazy
me and
seeing them,
fly
yeah.
right in front of me.
And well, maybe that's why they considered in this rite the heart was considered the most prized. I mean, the hummingbird has a lot of heart in it. I mean, the priests and the nobles, they ate the parts of the sacrificed flesh, but the heart was the most prized out of all of it.
And it's funny because that story of them taking the heart out and stuff. Steven Spielberg. Did you ever see the Temple of Doom, the Indiana Jones?
A long time ago.
But it's weird because as a little kid, I always thought that it was like a Mexican thing, but it takes place in India. But it's ridiculous because the whole, I don't think the Indians even ever sacrifice people and stuff,
You
like
don't
human
you don't hear
sacrifice
that as
isn't.
Yeah, I mean, you hear about when you talk about sacrifice in ancient cultures, the Aztec and the Mayan cultures come to the forefront of most people's minds when that's mentioned.
Yeah, and that entire ritual at the end of the movie, I think he was borrowing from Mexica type myth, or actuality. But I think that, because so much of the first movie took place in Mexico, he didn't want to revisit Mexico, so he had it happen in India. But it was funny because when that movie came out, it was one of the very first movies. It came out as PG, but it was really controversial because of the heart being torn out scene that they came up with the PG-13 rating. But
Right.
PG back in the 70s and 80s when I was a kid just meant parental guidance. And so a PG movie could have full frontal nudity, it could have violence, they could say the F word and things like that. And so it was like, well, because G is for general audiences, but PG is for parental
Well,
guidance.
since it was a completely different mentality back then, I think that there had not been so much discovery in Mexico and Central America of this stuff. So little, very, very little was known about it. I guess stereotypes were completely different. So
Yeah, and
maybe
we
that
were
a
we were
big part.
talking about that a little bit in the green room, how there's so much information that's come out even barely within the past 10, 20 years about the Mexica religion. Even that stone altar that I was talking about, where they tumble down and the bodies would land on this altar, that was only found within the last number of years. And we're still finding out more and more every single day. In fact, I have this book that's pretty popular. I think Barnes and Noble put it out, and you can find it in thrift stores for really cheap because they've printed tons of these. But it's so inaccurate. There's just tons of stuff I'll be reading about, and they'll have the wrong gods attributed to the wrong things. It's just funny how much we've learned, just even in the last 10, 20 years.
Yeah, even just the last 10 years. I mean, so much has come out. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that the god that we're talking about, he can either be symbolized by a hummingbird, or he can also be symbolized by an eagle sitting on a cactus holding a snake in one of its talons, which is what's on the flag of Mexico. So I thought that was worth
well,
mentioning.
where that comes from is that he was the god that told the people from Aztlan, which there's a lot of debate that Aztlan is actually Texas, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona, parts of California. But that when they headed south, that would be the symbol that they'd find to know that they'd found their promised land. And so he was the driving force that that told the people to search for that actual image in order to find where their homeland would be.
It's an interesting story. But yeah, now let's move on to the god Tezcatlipoca, which is the god of night, sorcery, and destiny. Now,
I wanted to just say really fast though, when they found that symbol of the eagle on the when they found that symbol of the eagle on the cactus with the snake in its mouth, it was on a small island that was in uninhabitable. The people had never lived on the island, and so at when the Mexica built their city, they built it on the small island, and then it was a lot like Venice and places like that, where they started to build out the land.
Yeah.
And where Mexico City is today, it was actually completely encircled by water.
Yeah, I remember reading about that years ago. I thought that was very interesting.
But back to Tezcatlipoca.
Yeah. So Tezcatlipoca. So as far as the sacrificial, first of all, his name means smoking mirror, or some people say obsidian smoking mirror, which is interesting.
Yeah, one interesting thing about that is that in the European grimoires and things, that is a way that they do divination is by looking into an obsidian or a black stone, and then to have the incense and the smoke rising in order to calm their minds and be able to scry and stuff like that, which was the same practice that was done in Mexica.
Well, they really considered, they really gave high significance to this obsidian. I mean, even their sacrificial blades were made of obsidian. I mean, they were just, but then again, it was probably something that was very, very common where they were. You know?
Well, and on that subject of the sacrificial blades, one of the ways that the prisoners were sacrificed to Tezcatlipoca is that they would put them on one of those altars with a post sticking out of the altar, and then tie the person to the altar, and then they'd have a warrior come in with those obsidian blades and attack them. But the people being attacked were given the same type of wooden sword, but instead of putting obsidian shards on the edges, they'd actually decorate it with feathers. And so it was really an unfair fight, because there's this guy with the sword made out of feathers when somebody
oh yeah, that was one of the sacrificial rites, like making it as gladiatorial combat, just making it completely impossible as far as your odds winning. Yeah, or they would have a boy be chosen to represent him for a year, and he'd walk around playing a flute, and then after the year was over, the boy would climb the pyramid, give his flute, and then they would sacrifice him right there, take his heart out.
And he would actually be considered an attribution of the god Tezcatlipoca, and kind of lived a high life for that whole year, where they give him offerings.
Yeah, but Yeah, he's often depicted with an obsidian mirror in place of one of his feet, and he's also represented as a jaguar.
Oh yeah.
Hmm.
And it's funny when you look at him, you could see his foot here.
Uh,
Is That's the black mirror, and then the smoke. So he does have one leg that's made out of a black smoking mirror, and then there's other black mirrors, obsidian mirrors around. Cool god. He's one of my favorite.
yeah, but yeah, as far as the boy goes, he was either played the character of Tezcatlipoca, the essence of him was either by a boy or a captive of war. They would oftentimes they would take sometimes they would take a captive of war, but he had to be the best looking and the most courageous warrior, and then he would take on the essence of Tezcatlipoca for a year if it wasn't a young boy.
And that did appear in the end of Apocalypto when the main character is being chased through the jungle and comes face to face with the jaguar.
Yeah. And that's such a cool movie, man. I'm gonna have to watch that again. But some people say he's a god of music, hence the flute, the symbolism of the flute. But yeah, anything else you want to say about him before we move on?
No, I think that's pretty. I mean, we've talked about him quite a bit in other episodes.
Hmm. Okay. All right. So now let's move on to Zutekutli, which is the god of fire and heat. And so 10 days before the festival of Iskali, what would happen was, first of all, go ahead and show a picture of Zutekutli.
I had a hard time finding him, but what in fact I don't think this mask really necessarily is, but there is a really popular mask that is represented by him, and
Mhm.
turquoise was really sacred to him, and so
Right.
they would do this intricate mosaic work with turquoise. And
Beautiful.
a lot of times when you find these turquoise masks, they are representative
Mhm.
of Kutle.
Yeah, well, like I was saying, animals would be captured and sacrificed on the first night alongside prisoners of war or captives of war. Um, and then the prisoners or the captors would be burned. But after the feast, the captives, what would happen is they'd be thrown into a fire, and then right before they died of being burned, they'd be taken out of the fire, and then their hearts would be removed. So it was like right before they were about to die in the fire.
Well, weren't you saying something too about them actually putting a hole in their chest that they put a lit post in
Yeah.
and light
So
it on fire?
yeah. So what would happen with that is the captives and the priests, they would climb a volcano at night, and then they would wait for Orion's belt to appear in the sky above them. And then when they would see Orion's belt, they'd rip the heart out and then burn a fire in the hole in the chest. And then from that fire, the victim's chest, people would light fires and then take that fire that they lit from that to the other ceremonial fires in the other temples,
Yeah, they
which
light up the whole town with it.
which I'm sure that has to be very powerful, because you're taking the life force of someone and then putting that life force in the temple, and that's got to be a big rejuvenation of energy.
Yeah, and there was the opposite side of that where if the fire didn't light for some reason, they'd see it as a really bad omen that would show that there might be pestilence and drought, and it could be a really bad sign if the fire didn't light properly.
Yeah, there would be. I mean, I guess maybe they thought there wasn't enough sacrifices or what, but that would be a bad omen if the fire didn't seem to light.
Because
So,
transformation is a really big attribute.
mhm. But yeah, other than that, as far as being fire, I think there's pretty much all there is to say about him, other than the fact that yeah, if the fire was lit, everything would all be well. If it wasn't, it was a bad omen. But if the flame didn't light, then it was, sometimes they thought it was to signal the coming of some kind of monster, and would roam the darkness and go around eating people. So I don't know if they thought maybe if there was some other creature in the jungle that they weren't too familiar with, and it was rare. Maybe they thought he was some kind of monster, or because I'm having a hard time picturing an actual mythical monster coming by and terrorizing if he's displeased. Not to say that that can't happen, but
well, that's another thing to point out about him is that that was during the long calendar, and so unlike an annual calendar, when the calendar would go through like 4 or 5 stages or whatever, then that celebration would be attributed to him.
All right, we have anything else you want to say about him before we move on?
No, I was a little less familiar with that god. I think some of that stuff is more recent, the discoveries that have been made. But I just did think that was interesting with how he was the one that brought fire to humanity, and
and Prometheus, the similarities. That is there is some kind of parallel going on there. And that's something that I want to look into more and take a look at that. But if nothing else, let's move on to Tlaloc, which is the god of rain and earthly fertility. Now go ahead and show a picture of Tlaloc, if you would.
I have a couple of them here. This one is super cool. You can usually tell Tlaloc because he'll have these weird goggles, and then usually will have flames or fire coming out of his mouth. But this is a terracotta type incense burner that you'd light up, and then it has holes under here, so the smoke would bellow and move up its face and things like that. Here's another right here. You can see the goggle type eyes.
Yeah.
There's the kind of goggly eyes with the fangs sticking out of his face. And I had one more image. One of the oldest deities, and actually was worshipped not only by the Mexica, but by other cultures as well down in South America.
Right. Yeah, so this god, he desired children as sacrifices. So that's what he preferred. So children would be sacrificed in his name. And the Aztecs believed that if he did not get enough children sacrificed, he would ruin crops. He would hold back the rainwater and send diseases throughout the land. So that's why a lot of children were sacrificed to Tlaloc.
Well, and an interesting thing about that is that the children were actually tortured because they would cry, and the tears of them crying would represent the rain, and so they wanted him to cry as much as possible to represent.
So like the more they cried, the stronger the magic was, the stronger the rite was. But they would buy the children from the mothers and then torture and sacrifice them each of the 4 months that the festival was going on. But
one interesting thing that I discovered, and a lot of the old grimoires in Europe that came out, they came out around the time that the Americas were discovered, and a lot of these reports and pillagings and stuff were making it back to Spain and Portugal and the different areas where these grimoires come from. But a really popular deity or demon is Kalnak. And the similarities in their sound of their name, I almost wonder if they heard that phonetically and attributed this demon. But it's curious because this is the demon's actual sigil.
Yeah.
But up until about 10 years ago, tons of people thought that this was the sigil for Kalnak. And
I
they
remember
actually
that. I remember that
and
back in the day. In fact, I used to use that sigil when I used to contact Klonick back in the day, or try to contact him.
yeah, and you know, he gives good fortune and money and things like that. But it's just funny because it's pretty obviously that there's three different sigils for Lucifer. This one being the most known and common. But there it is right there with the one of the
Mm.
sigils for Lucifer that people were calling Chalnak.
Okay, so that,
So
that original sigil for that was supposedly for Klonick. I mean, what is that really?
yeah, that,
I mean that
you
other
mean
one.
the
Where did that come from? Like, where did people get that from?
yeah. So in the when you go back to the earliest grimoires, there are the three different sigils for Lucifer, and it's just one of the sigils for Lucifer. But you
Right.
can see in this one, it has like a all-seeing eye kind of thing down
Yeah.
here, and you could see, you know, they're this. Both of these are. It's kind
Very.
of like telephone, you know, where like it gets passed on, becomes a meme, changes, gets
Yeah.
the form changes a little bit
That
because
symbol
these
is imbued with so much energy though from all these people.
you can see the difference. I don't know if you
Yeah.
see the full thing, but like these with Beelzebub, they're the same sigils, but you could see through time how they got
Hmm.
slowly changed and
I like that you pointed
started.
that out. That's something to think about. But yeah, do you have anything else you want to say about Tlaloc?
No, just that, you know, living here in Arizona during the summer times, the monsoons are so important, and we don't get very many of them this last couple years. But
Mm.
when they come in, they're so powerful. The whole sky just turns black, and lightning streaks this back and forth the sky, and it's just a constant downpour. Comes down so crazy and hard, and you can see how people in Mexico and South America and the rains were so important to them. And if it stopped raining, then you could see the, you know, the wrath that was attributed to drought and famine and things
Start
like that. And
sacrificing your neighbor, man.
yeah. And they really did, you know, that was their whole concept of time, was that, you know, if we don't keep this up and keep doing it, then, you know,
Like
bad times are going to
they
come.
believe that the more sacrifices they did, the more the end of the world was postponed. That's what happened.
Yeah, it's just so interesting. It makes you really wish that we had more information and more of that culture was able to
Well,
survive.
what's interesting is that human sacrifice was such a big part of their culture. I mean, I would have to say that human sacrifice was as big a part of their culture as the NFL is today in the United States. You know what I mean? It's just, like
And
um,
that's an interesting
everyone seems to have a part in it.
that's an interesting point to make. I don't know if you've heard of Alarma magazine. Do you know Alarma? It's a
I've
Mexican
heard of it, but I don't
magazine.
know what it is. What is it?
What they are, they're death tabloids. So they're like
Oh, yeah,
ambulance
yeah, yeah.
chasers that and
All the
it's
murders.
crazy because yeah, a lot of it are like the drug cartels and stuff that you know, I think that the drug cartels are emboldened a lot of the time by some of
It's
these
it's almost
Aztec
like it's in
type
their
of.
blood to just be like that. I mean, they're still decapitating people and
But
sacrificing.
the magazines are really funny because the centerfold will usually either be like a religious type of thing like this.
And then it's just blood and gore, everything else.
Yeah, or else yeah.
Oh, you got some
Centerfolds
women
like
in
this.
there too?
Yeah, so depending on the issue, you either have like a religious message, but it is
You got a
crazy. You
Jesus
can
centerfold, and then you got a woman centerfold, and then you got some kind of gore going on.
we've talked in the past about Zepe
Secret Toltec, yeah.
Toltec. Um, but here's an example. You know,
The skin that would have
they
people's And
yeah, they'd fillet the skin, and then this is a cement post, and these are the drug cartels. And
so that and there it's still the same thing going on.
but it's pretty gruesome scene, just like it looks like a rubber mask sitting on there, but it's
Yeah.
like somebody's real face on the skin.
Oh well, not too much has changed, I guess. But so yeah, it looks like that's about it as far as the four gods that we chose to talk about. That anything else you want to go ahead and say before we call it a video?
Oh, just real quick, I did have some pictures of Huitzilopochtli's mother, um, Huitzilopochtli, the skirt where she had serpent skirts. But I think what's really cool about her is that there's almost an optical illusion effect where with this giant statue of her, you can see that these two serpents that look like two serpents kissing like this.
Mhm.
But then it's an optical illusion where at the same time it's a face, the
It's
fangs are
looking like her.
here. Yeah, it's a face looking at you straight on as well as, so it just shows how amazing their art was and how they had like almost these optical illusion effects that were going on in their artwork. And that's one of the most terrifying images, with all the skulls and hands. It
That's
was
pretty
almost
cool.
like Callie, where she has the hearts and the hands and the skull all around her.
That's
I
really
just
cool.
love that image of her. But she was his mother that was impregnated by a feathered ball. and then his sister was decapitated, and her arms and legs are torn
Right.
off. And,
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Thanks for coming on, and it's always good talking about ancient Aztec and ancient Mayan culture with you.
yeah, I love the Mexica stuff. So thanks for letting me talk about
Yeah.
it.
No
It's really a
problem.
fun
No problem.
conversation.
Everybody who's watching, make sure you check out Gazelam's all his links below in the video description. Check those out. Give him a follow. And everyone who's watching, like and subscribe to Dark Sorcery.
Nice.